I am actually not going to talk about tariffs at all. I am going to talk about something I think that is far more timeless than tariffs. Something that is far more important to every single person in this room. Now, I'm not doing that because I am afraid of a little controversy. I spent the 5 years working for Monsanto, and I was the awkwardly titled Director of Millennial Engagement. It's okay to laugh at it. I laughed at it too when I first started in this job. And actually, that fancy title, really all that means is, you know how there are people that have strong feelings about GMOs and pesticides? It was my job to go talk to those people. Now, there's an interesting thing about going and talking with rooms full of people that have very strong opinions about what you're talking about. Typically, they also don't know very much at all about what they have strong opinions about. Now, the interesting thing is, my goal when talking with them was to move them from this position to something closer to my own position, about how modern farming is growing food more bountifully, more effectively than it has in the entire history of time. Now, doing that, I think for a lot of people would feel intimidating, but I actually really loved the intensity of that, because there was something that we were going for. There was something that we could kind of tussle over. But what I'm going to talk about today is actually, I think, a more difficult conversation to have. Because while every person that I was talking to when I was Director of Millennial Engagement felt like, hey, maybe they knew a little bit of something about farming, maybe they felt like it was something that was kind of important, but at the end of the day, they would leave that room and they would go on to the rest of their lives. But what I'm going to talk about today is something that every single person in this room has thought about. Now, you might have thought about it in a way that you just think about it a little bit and you try and push it out of your mind. Or you've had deep, deep conversations with your spouse or your parents or your children about it. And that is the concept of succession. Now, I'm not here to talk about things that are normally talked about with succession. Accounting, legal. Those are all of the things that are important, deeply important. You have to figure out, how am I going to set up the structure of my farm to be able to pass it down? You have to know well in advance, how am I going to set this up so that my farm can be bought by my children, or we can arrange the setup in such a way. Now, this is all important and it's difficult, and it's just like taxes. You can put it off for a really long time, but there's actually a level that's above that. And I would actually suggest that it's maybe the most important conversation that you will have with yourself, because it is the question of, what is it that I am passing down? Now, I don't actually come from a farm background. I grew up in small town central Illinois, and so while I baled hay and walked beans, I didn't come from agriculture. I grew up as the middle child of 7 kids, and one day my father came to me and he said, "Vance, I need your help." Now, my father I viewed like Superman, and there are 6 other people that he could go to for help. So the fact that he wanted me just built up and welled up in me an energy that I could barely contain. My dad looks at me, I'm 10 years old, and he says, "Vance, I want you to go out to the garage, and I want you to get your grandfather's axe and bring it out to the wood pile." This was the most amazing thing that he could have asked me. It was like anointing me Davy Crockett or Daniel Boone, one of these frontiersmen. So I go running outside, leap off the stairs, go to the garage. I know exactly where this axe is. Now I'm 10, so I have to set up a ladder and climb up on it so that I can take it off the wall. And when I get it off the wall and I start walking towards my dad, I'm carrying it like it's the Dead Sea Scrolls. I get outside, and my father already has his small toolbox out there. He takes the axe from me and very expertly, deftly takes out his file and starts sharpening it. He looks at it. He's kind of talking to me. I don't hear anything. There's just a ringing in my ears that I am so excited that I may, for the first time in my life, get to swing this axe that is as large as I am. And so my dad takes this log, and he sets it up on another log, and he reaches back, and he brings it forward in that perfect way, and it is a crack all the way through it. This log is split in two perfectly. Then he pushes one of the logs off, and he turns it, he reaches back, and he does it again, all the way through it, crack. And you can hear that crack like a bell ringing against the yard. It's just absolutely beautiful. So then he motions to me to pick up the other log that's sitting down there and put it on there. And then he hands me the axe. And at 10 years old, I'm holding this thing as tightly as I can. I try and mimic exactly what he has done. And I lift it over my arm and over my head, and I'm about to swing it down. Now, every single person in this room knows exactly what is about to happen except that 10-year-old boy. Because I go to ring that thing down, and I land right on the handle. And that rattling goes all the way up my arm, something that every single one of you that's ever swung an axe knows exactly what I'm talking about. And my dad, I look up, he does that kind of grimace that we all would. And then he motions for me to do it again. Again, I put my arm up there, and again, I swing it down and just hit the handle. And so now I'm not thinking that wielding an axe is so great because I can feel that vibration all the way through me. But my dad again motions me to do this. And by the time I swing it in and I get it that maybe 2 centimeters into the wood, and now I'm swinging the wood around trying to get it off there and picking on my foot, right? I'm going through the motions that every single person that's ever wielded an axe has to go through. My dad sits there calmly, and we walk through how to split that piece of wood. It probably takes me 10 to 15 minutes to get all the way through it. And then he says, all right, well, this pile is yours, and ask me if you need anything. And so it isn't long before I have to go into the house and tell my dad I broke the handle. And now he comes back out, and he tells me the story of how he broke the handle, and how you have to take it off, and then you get the wedge out and take the pins out, and you put a new handle in, and we fixed it together. And over the years, I used that axe every summer and chopped countless amounts of wood. And over time, I, of course, lost the wedge or had to get new pins. And in fact, I'm even sure I changed out the head of that axe. Then 15 years later, when my wife and I came home to tell my parents that we were finally pregnant with our first child. We were finally going to have our first child, and this is a wonderful moment. We have a great time with my parents, and just as we're about to leave, my dad pulls me aside, and he says, Vance, I want you to go get your grandfather's axe, and I want you to take it home with you. And so I go back out there again like it's the Dead Sea Scrolls. I take it, and I put it in the back of our vehicle. And I am so excited as we're backing out of the driveway, telling my wife that I have my grandfather's axe. And she doesn't have to look back there very long to know there is no chance that a single piece of that axe was ever my grandfather's. And so she turns to me and says, are you sure that's your grandfather's axe? And it's actually a question I would ask you. Is that my grandfather's axe? Well, I think this is an important question because it begs the question, what is my grandfather's axe? What was being passed down? Was it the physical object? Or was it something else? Now, this is something that goes on with your operation right now. Is your operation the same operation that maybe was handed down to you? Do you anticipate, even if you're a first-generation farmer, that what you pass down to your children, maybe even to your grandchildren, must stay the same to be what you've passed down? When you are passing something down, what is it that you're passing down? What matters the most? Is it the physical object? Is it the assets? Is it the capital that you have? Well, I now no longer work for Monsanto. I actually run a company called Legacy Interviews, where people travel from around the United States and Canada to my studio, and we sit down for a few hours or a full day, and I record them telling their life stories. And we do this so that they can pass these life stories down to their children, to their grandchildren, to their great-grandchildren. And this has been a fantastic adventure, because every time somebody comes into my studio, they get to talk about the most important thing that they have gathered through this experience that we call life. They are actually taking all of the experiences, all of the successes, all of the failures, all of those things that made their life, and we are doing something so rare because most of the time, nobody ever gets to sit down and look back on their lives. And so through this, I've had a chance to discover what is deeply important. When people are asking themselves, what is it that I should share so that my future generations can know me and can learn from all of the things that I went through, what is it that I can share with them? And that's what I want to bring you today. Not their stories in particular. I'm not here to tell you about what Steve and his wife went through, or how when they first walked in, they didn't want to tell their stories, but then eventually they opened up and they're telling all kinds of great stories. That's not what I want to do. What I want to talk about today is, how can you be thinking about passing down something more valuable than just the assets of your farm? And we're going to do that by talking about three things. What are the stories that you should be telling? And how can you tell those stories so that children that are busy, that think they know you, that are running around in all kinds of different directions, that have always been around you, so that they want to hear those stories? Then I want to talk about interests. How can you understand what it is that the next generation wants? Because by understanding what it is that they want, what they view their future as being, you can help to navigate what it is that you're passing down and how you pass it down. And then finally, I want to talk with you about maybe one of the most uncomfortable subjects of all, which is power. You see, power is that thing that is so difficult to let go of. Power is the ability to make the decisions about how are we doing things, what's going to happen. And if you have been somebody that has been able to responsibly manage your operation, if you've been able to keep it going for another generation, you were able to build it from something that it wasn't before, handing that down is incredibly difficult. But in talking to hundreds of people doing their legacy interviews, I've learned a few things about how you can pass this down, and about how you can make sure that the responsibilities that you're handing down your children are ready for. Before we begin, we should talk about the cost of failure. What happens if you are not able to successfully pass down your farm? What happens if you're not able to successfully move down the things that you've built to the next generation? I think this is why when so many people come in to talk with me about their life stories, this is an area of real tension, fear even. Because they wonder, will these children, will these grandchildren, great-grandchildren, will they know how to handle things? Will they understand what our family went through? Am I going to be able to push that down into the future? And this is not an unreasonable fear. I don't know if anybody in this room is familiar with Roman concrete. But nearly 2,000 years ago, the Romans were building with a form of concrete that is structurally far more sound than any of the concrete we use. In fact, they have columns and pillars made out of this concrete that have been able to withstand some of the biggest seismic activities in all of Europe. Not only are they able to withstand that, but even if they get a crack in them, if you expose them to seawater, the cracks will heal. Now, they had this technology about 2,000 years ago, but over time, that technology was actually lost. People forgot how they made it. Now, scientists today can take samples of this Roman concrete and they can run it through incredibly sophisticated equipment, and they can tell you exactly what that thing is made up of. But what they can't tell you is how they did it, how to mix it together. And in fact, if you want to make Roman concrete, it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars for just a few cubic yards of it. This did not cost them that much, and so we've lost something. Now, this is hard for us to imagine because in the digital age, we feel like every piece of information that we would ever want is at the tips of our fingers. It's on either Google, or you can get it from AI, or it's written down in some book somewhere. But there is so much about what you do on your operation that has never been written down. And in fact, it couldn't be written down. Now, I'm not talking about the physical aspects of farming alone. I mean, I interview people all the time that were the last generation to farm using plows drawn by horses, right? If you wanted to go out and start having people harvest or plow their land with horses, it would be nearly impossible. That information has been lost. But that's actually not what I'm talking about. Everybody in this room knows that farming is more than just the physical aspects of farming. It's about building relationships. It's about the values that you have. It's about connecting and sharing and being able to do things that you couldn't write down on a balance sheet, and you certainly couldn't put it in a book. So the only way that your technology, this social technology, this thing that allows farmers to be able to transcend and go generation after generation, can't be written down. It has to be passed down person to person, family to family, from one family to a new generation. Sometimes maybe you don't have kids that are around, but you found somebody that you think can carry on that tradition, but you can't just hand them a book about what you did. You can't even just hand them your diary of all the activities that you did. There's something more there. And so that is the most complicated thing to pass down, and yet it's the most valuable. Because even if you're able to pass down your assets, if the next generation doesn't understand how to use those assets, how to be a part of their community, how to be a part of an organization like Ontario Grain Growers, then they won't be able to continue it. Maybe they would be able to do it for one more generation, but they certainly won't be able to teach their children how to do it. And so, we should talk about stories. Almost everything that human beings know is through stories. There are a few things that you maybe know from a technical level, or from an engineering level, or from an actual physical, how does this engine go together? But almost everything else about the way you work, about the way you operate in the world, is done based on stories. Stories are what tell us who is us and who is them. Stories tell us about what is the right way to be and the way we shouldn't be. Stories tell us about where did we come from and where are we going. Without stories, we have no way to orient ourselves as human beings towards a certain direction. And this is something we can kind of all intuitively know, but there is a fascinating study done by scientists at Duke and Emory University in the United States where they came up with this do you know scale. The do you know scale is a list of 20 questions. Now these 20 questions are answered just yes or no. There's no details in it. Now these questions are quite interesting. I'll show you a few of them. They're things like, do you know how your grandparents met? Which person in your family, do you know which person in your family you act the most like? Do you know whose relative's face froze in a grumpy position? Do any of you know the relative's face that froze in a grumpy position? I do. It was Uncle Larry, and I was always told, if you keep looking like that, you're going to look like Uncle Larry. Now, the funny thing about this scale, this 20-question scale, is that if you answer somewhere over 10 as yes, they can start to detect that the likelihood that you will get depression, anxiety, drug addiction, go to prison, all goes down. This is fascinating, right? That means the stories themselves, the thing that help us to understand who are we, where did we come from, what are we all about, where are we going, who is us, can actually tie you in to the fabric that allows you to transcend when the inevitable bad things that happen in life come to us. This is such a profound finding because it turns out it's not just biological children. Adopted children that can answer a certain number of these questions as yes about their adopted family get the same benefit. This tells me that the stories that we're passing down, even if they don't seem consequential, even if they don't seem that important, tie us to a longer history. And being tied to that longer history allows us to get past times that are incredibly difficult in our lives. And every single person in here has had to overcome difficult things in their lives. Now, I am very familiar with people telling stories about their lives. So I've heard when people come in and they want to talk about, hey, these are stories that I want to put out in the world. And so I thought what I would do is create a little graph to show you why some stories are better than others. And when you look at these graphs, you can tell there's a plus side, things are getting better. There's a minus side, things are not going so well. And there's just kind of neutral. And people's stories, often they have to go in a linear set. So, for example, you've all seen or heard these stories where somebody said, well, I woke up this morning and then I ate and then I went to work and then I came home from work and then I went to bed, right? This is just the retelling of a linear series of events. Those stories are boring. But we tell a lot of those stories, right? Because we aren't actually thinking about it. We're just recounting in our minds. This is actually the natural state of things when you're just recalling what happened. Now, there's another set of stories that are very, very common. And this is when every single thing since the moment you woke up, it got better. You woke up and you were successful. And then another great thing happened to you and you were just doing great and everything was just getting better and better and better. Those are oftentimes seed ads, right? Or they're the stories that your friends tell that you don't like. Why? Because those stories are bragging. And while bragging feels really good to the person telling the story, there's actually nothing in it for the person listening. And so this is not a story that gets retold. And really, the only stories that matter are the stories that are retold. And so if you are telling stories where somebody doesn't actually get something out of that story, then it's not going to be retold. It's not going to even be remembered. Now, of course, there's always the other type of storyteller, which is everything's getting worse, nothing worked at all, you're just lucky because it worked out for you, but it never works out for me. That guy is a sad bastard. Now, it's funny, right? We all laugh about that, but how many people are we around that is what they tell about? They're trying to get something off their mind. They're hungover. They're not feeling very good. And so, yes, of course, they tell these sad stories, but sad stories are never retold either. The only thing that we talk about with sad bastards and braggarts are that they are sad bastards and braggarts. We don't actually tell their stories. But now let's look at the stories that do get told. The stories that get told over and over and over again, the ones that your children come in and ask you to tell, are the ones where maybe things weren't going so well, but then you made a change. And that change is when things started going better. Now, it doesn't mean that you made that change and now you were wildly successful. What we care about in every single story is what was happening to that person, so you can try and back away from it. I don't want that thing to happen to me. And then when they start to tell you about how they changed and what happened that they started to go up, that's when we start leaning in. We want to know those stories. And in fact, those are the very beginnings of wisdom. Wisdom is the act of understanding what was it that your life was headed towards, and then you had to learn a lesson. And that lesson is what allowed you to change so that you could start going up. Now, an even better story, in fact, the hero's journey story, the ones that we're wrapped up into in movies and storybooks, and the ones that you just absolutely love hearing your family members tell, are when they go up, and then down, and then up again. And what do I mean by this? So those stories where you're like, there I was, everything was going great, things were getting better, and then a turning point happened. Something I didn't expect. Some weather event, some person that I trusted, some person that I shouldn't have trusted, something happened where all the things were going well and now they aren't. And then you hit a low point where you can go no longer and you have to make a change. These are, over here, these fascinating and interesting stories are what are classically known as comedies. And a comedy doesn't actually have to be funny. A comedy just means that as you end the story, the hero learned a lesson and they got better. But not all stories, in fact, not all the most fascinating stories, need to follow this line. In fact, if we look at some of the more interesting stories of our lifetimes, of our society, our civilization, Romeo and Juliet, right? There are experiences where the hero didn't change in time. And so, they died, or they lost their family, or they lost the farm. These are tragedies. And tragedies have an incredibly important tale to them. They are very important in family stories because it helps you to understand what happens if you don't make the change. What happens if you don't learn from your mistakes? These are the stories that we tell about black sheep. Black sheep in our families are the ones that didn't change. I can tell you a small story about the black sheep in my family. You see, in my family of 7 kids, it was absolutely incredibly important that when we're sitting at dinner, if Dad reached to the plate of the pork chops or the whatever we had, and he said, "Would anyone like the last one of this?" Everyone's answer was, "No, I don't want that," right? And the reason we all knew that was because they told us the story over and over and over again about Uncle Bill, who every time he was offered the plate, he'd reach over and be like, "Yeah, thanks, Jim." And he'd take it from his plate and put it on his. And so we would always say, "You don't want to be like Uncle Bill, he has no manners." Now these stories may seem like a fun, trite thing to teach somebody. But I can tell you, I have never been visiting at anyone's home in my entire life and taken the last of anything. And so my family, through the stories of black sheep, taught me how to behave, how to interact with the world, how to be more successful. Your family has those stories. You have stories both of change that happened, that you were able to overcome tragedies, and those where you notice that somebody didn't overcome them, and you want to avoid that. These stories are perhaps the most important thing that you can pass on because they will be timeless. They will far, far outlast the assets. Now, when people come into my Legacy Interviews studios, usually they come in as a couple. And oftentimes what happens is it's adult children that maybe have some kids that are 20 or 10, and they have parents that are getting a little older. And so they buy the interview for their parents, and one parent is elated. They are so excited to tell their story. They walk into my studio in the morning and they're like, "Where are the cameras? Let me sit down. I'm ready to go." And then their spouse walks in, and their arms are crossed, and they are not super friendly and a little bit cold, and they say things like, "I don't know what we're doing here. I don't know why we're doing this." And then they always say the thing that many, many people believe. I don't have any stories to tell. And for a long time, I've been doing this now for 5 years, I used to actually try and argue that out of people. My natural disposition was to be like, no, sure you got some stories, come on, yeah, of course you do, right? We'll think of them. Because I thought that this would help them get over that fear. But I don't actually do that anymore. Now, I talk with them about something far more simple. And in fact, if you are sitting in the audience right now and you're thinking, I don't know, maybe I have a couple of stories, but I don't really have something, I would ask you, when can you think of a time when you did something wrong? Can you think of a time when you made a mistake? Now, every single person in this room has an idea immediately come to mind about mistakes you've made. And that's okay. Because heroes must have flaws. The stories we tell have to have experiences where things didn't go the way that you thought that they should, and you had to learn a lesson about who to trust, about how big of a deal to get into, about the chances that you could take, but maybe you made the wrong choice and you didn't take that chance. And when we start thinking about the flaws that we have, we shouldn't be embarrassed of that. Because when people tell me about the stories that they heard their parents tell during their legacy interview, those are the stories that light them up. I had no idea that Dad struggled with alcohol. I had absolutely no concept that my mother and her father had a difficult relationship, or that my parents went through a point of bankruptcy or almost bankruptcy. But when a young person hears stories about flaws, about mistakes, about when things went wrong, that is when you are passing down wisdom. Now let's talk about interests. Because I think there are a lot of people, when they go to think about how am I going to pass down the farm, they think about, do my children want it? Will my children do the right thing with it? What is it that they want? How can I know that? Now, my background is actually not in storytelling, it's not in marketing, it's in negotiations. And in negotiations, perhaps the most important negotiations strategy I learned about is called interest-based negotiating. And in order to understand interest-based negotiating, we should first understand what the natural form of negotiating is, which is position-based. Let's imagine that you and I both want this orange. If we're a position-based negotiator, what are our options? You can get an orange and I can get nothing. I could get the orange and you could get nothing. Or the thing that everybody in here is thinking already, what should we do? Cut it in half. You take half and I take half. Now, to an interest-based negotiator, this compromise, this cutting it in half, might well be complete failure. Because while you got half of what you wanted, you also maybe didn't get half of what you wanted. So the interest-based negotiator wants to know something deeper. They want to know, why do you want that orange? What is it that you are looking for in this orange that will help you? Because our automatic assumption is that you want the orange for the same reason that I want the orange. So if we imagine that, then the only thing we can do is cut it in half. But what if I ask you questions more deeply and I find out, oh, you're thirsty and I am making essential oils? Well, now we can squeeze the orange and you can take 100% of the juice and I can take the leftover of the peel and get the whole thing. Understanding why people want what they want is very, very important. Because it allows you to understand, what is it that I can do to make it so you get what you want and I get what I want? And how this plays out with succession is thinking about the future. Now, there's this funny paradox. I don't know how many of you have ever worked in corporate America, but if you have, you know that every once in a while you'll sit down with your boss and your boss will take in a deep breath as you have this very important conversation and they say, where do you see yourself in the next 5 years? And this is a question that somebody like Vince McMahon, the guy that started all the professional wrestling and made it a huge, big deal, he had to face. And I heard him one time in an interview, and he said something absolutely brilliant. I'd never thought of it before. He said, that question doesn't tell you anything at all. Because, particularly with him, he's dealing with all these giant hulking men that they all want to be in the spotlight. They all want to be the big, important person. So if he asks them, what do you want to be in 5 years? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? They're all going to shoot for as high as they think they can without coming off as arrogant. This happens as well in our own operations, right? If you ask yourself, well, what is it that you want? People are going to say the highest level that they think that they can without offending you. Like, well, I don't want to take over, but I'm definitely want to get some opportunities to make change, and I want to do these things. So they never actually have a real conversation with you. So what Vince McMahon started asking was not, where do you see yourself in 5 years, but instead, what is the greatest contribution you can make here? This inverts the question. This allows a person not to think about where it is that they're going, but what is it that they bring to the operation? What is it that they can add to it? And when you ask them about this, they will describe things about changes that they could make, about things that they could add to it that you might not know. And it will reveal their interests in a very important way. Now, there is another thing that I've learned that's going to seem a little counterintuitive. You don't know what you think until you say it out loud. And so many people, when they're talking about their futures or their pasts, if they've never said it out loud or written it down, they've never actually thought about it. And so when you have this first conversation, and oftentimes the first conversation is the hardest one, it doesn't need to be the last conversation. Many times when you're talking with somebody and they're saying what contribution they think they can make, what interests they have in the future, when they're saying it out loud, it's the first time that they've actually thought it out from A to Z. And so being flexible with people, allowing them to say something one day, and coming back to them in a week or in 2 weeks and having a conversation with them again, allowing them to be flexible is important, because maybe the first time you've ever asked them about the contribution they can make is the first time they've ever thought about it. Now, as you start to think about transition, the hardest part about transition is power. What is power? Power is the ability to make decisions about what's going to happen. Power is the person that knows that even if everybody's talking and they're making choices and they're making recommendations, there's almost always one person that gets to decide, are we going to take those or not? Are we actually going to do what people are recommending? So if you're thinking about handing down power, you should ask yourself the question, who has power in your operation? Now, sociologists have done these incredible research studies where they've put cameras in a room where people are making decisions. And there might be somebody that has the title of president or chief decision maker, right? But when a question comes up and a decision has to be made, scientists, without even hearing the questions themselves, can say, this person, not the person with the title, is the one that has the power. And how do we know? Because when the decision gets made, everybody looks at that person. So titles alone are not enough to be able to hand down power. It has to be a real and tangible thing. Can a person make a decision in your operation? And if they can't decide something that goes against what either you want or the big man wants or big mom wants, then they're not in control, they're not in power. And so when you're thinking about transferring power, there is this concept called borrowed to earned power. Borrowed power is the very beginning of passing power down. It's the ability to go to somebody and say, I want you to go to the grain growers and I want you to represent our family, or I want you to represent our district. Now, that person going and everybody in the meeting knows there's another person back home, maybe that gets to decide whether we make that purchase or whether we sell that ground or what we're going to do with the equipment. There's somebody that gets to make that decision, but at first you say, you go and represent us. And as a person goes and represents, everybody looks at them and says, well, we know the power is actually behind them. But if you go and you keep giving them a chance to have that borrowed power, then eventually they're going to make some changes. And if you allow them to make those changes, then people around them will start to agree that this person is actually making a few changes. They actually have the power to it. So somebody goes from having borrowed power to earned power, when as they make those decisions, people start realizing, hey, this is good. We're getting things done. We're actually able to make differences in our operation than we thought we were before. Borrowed to earned power is far more effective than waiting until the end and then all the power transfers at once. Because borrowed power doesn't confer all of the responsibility on that person. And so if they make a mistake, the person that handed down that power has a chance to step in and make things right. But this is a balance. This is a thing that must be coordinated, because sometimes as the person that's in power that wants to make those decisions, you have to let somebody fail. Because that failure is where they will have the story that allows them to have wisdom. Now, if you are in the position of offering somebody borrowed power, and they go and they make a mistake, the obvious way, the way that we are kind of intuitively wired, is to go to them and say, why did you do that? How many in here have ever been asked the question, why did you do that? Every one of us, right? And it's particularly tough when it's the person in charge asking, why did you do that? Now, I'll let you in on a little secret about psychology. Most of what we do is not based on long, thought-out reasoning. Most of what we do is actually just reacting to what's going on around us. So if you ask a person, why did you do that? And they've put people in MRIs to study this, what they do when you ask them why is they make something up. Because we don't know why we do what we do. And so if you ask somebody, why did you do that? Now all of a sudden they're kind of pushed backwards. And now they're wondering, should I try and be defensive? Should I try and frame why I did it in this way so that way it doesn't look that bad, or I can shift guilt onto somebody else? How can I do this so that I come out well? And now you're not actually communicating. What you're doing is you're negotiating responsibility. So what can you ask instead? Well, I've learned through doing hundreds of interviews that if you, instead of asking somebody, why did you do that, you ask them, how did you do it? How did you decide to make that choice? How is it that you got to a point where all of the pigs were out of the barn? How did you come up with the way you wanted to move forward? When you ask people the question how, it changes how they approach the question. Because now, instead of being defensive and being knocked back, they are instead going back to the beginning of the story. And then they say, well, it started here, and then I made this decision, and then I did this, and then I did this. And as people tell that how, that linear series of events, why will emerge. Why will show up where that thing was that they didn't expect, or what happened that caused them to fall down. And now you'll be able to get people to open up to you and learn from those experiences on a much deeper level than if you had just asked them, why did you do that? And finally, with power, it is so difficult to know who has power and how it's being handed down. And if you're a young person, sometimes you get offered an opportunity to make decisions in your operation, to make changes, and it doesn't feel right. For example, people come into the office and they look at you answering the question, and then they look over at Dad to make sure he's shaking his head yes. And one day, I was interviewing a family that had been that ran a grain elevator. And they talked about how hard it was, both for the customers that were coming in and asking questions of the new boss that had the president stamp on his desk. Not only did the customers look over at Dad to make sure that he agreed with the decision, but the son did too. And I asked him, how did you get past this? How did you employ your son to be able to make it so he knew he could make decisions, even if he knew he was going to make a decision different than what you would do? And he said, well, I took my wife's advice. And instead of giving him this brand new chair that made him look all important, I actually gave him my chair. And I had him sit in my chair as he made those decisions. And there was something about the fact that he was sitting in a chair that had always been mine that made him feel empowered. And people that came into the office and the other employees in the office saw that he was sitting in the actual chair. And so as you are thinking about power and how you hand it down, think about symbolism. What is it that I can pass down that actually will help this person to understand more than just my words? What is it that I'm handing down to them? Because like we said in the beginning, human beings, almost everything that we know comes from stories and the symbols that go along with those stories. And so just like my father came to me and said, Vance, I want you to take your grandfather's axe, now I knew that a power transition had happened. It wasn't just the physical object. It wasn't just the thing that he gave me that was so valuable. Now he was giving me a physical object that told me something very important. Something that was more valuable than the fact that these were like the Dead Sea Scrolls and I wanted it and it was something so great. I mean, the axe itself had almost no worth at all. But now, as I'm driving this home and I'm picking out where I'm going to put it in the garage, I now have to internalize that in 10 years, I'm going to have to let my child take that axe off the wall and walk it out and sharpen it and let them swing it when it is going to be deeply uncomfortable for me. You know, I think back to my dad and him allowing me to swing that axe. The true act there was him allowing me to try something, allowing me to be the one that swung the axe, allowing me to break the handle, allowing me to learn how to use that axe. And what he gave me in giving me that axe was not the axe itself, it was the lesson for how I will pass that on to my own children. As you head back home today from this conference, think about these things. Think about the stories that you have to tell, the ones where you fell down. Because I assure you, no matter how busy you are, if you have stories where you fell down and you're willing to tell your children, they will listen. I want you to think about their interests and how you can set up an occasion to talk about what is the contribution that they can add. And as you hear about that contribution, think about what is it that I can do to distribute power to them, to allow them to borrow it, allow them to try things out. And when they ultimately fail, how can I ask them the right questions so that they can dig out their own wisdom and have that wisdom to pass on to future generations? So, I know I gave you a reprieve from your drinking game today by not talking about tariffs. And I hope that you all have an experience going forward, even if you are not a person that had anything handed down to you, thinking about what tradition you can create to hand down what you have built to your future generations. Thank you.